On the morning of D-Day, a 26-year-old lieutenant named Richard Winters from the 101st Airborne Division lay flat in the grass outside a French farmhouse called Brecourt Manor. He stared across an open field at 4 German cannons that were tearing apart American soldiers landing on Utah Beach below. He had 12 men with him, and on the other side of that field sat roughly 60 German soldiers, dug into trenches and backed by machine guns. Winters gave the order to attack anyway. Within a few hours, every single one of those cannons was destroyed. The German position was wiped out, and a battle that should have been suicide became one of the most brilliant tactical victories of the war. But that wasn't even close to the most embarrassing thing the 101st Airborne Division did to Hitler's army. But Brecourt Manor was just one fight in a much bigger story. The 101st Airborne Division, better known as the Screaming Eagles, had dropped into Normandy under the command of Major General Maxwell Taylor, a career officer from Missouri who had never even fought in combat before that night. Nobody expected a brand new airborne division scattered across cow pastures in the middle of the night to accomplish much of anything. But Brecourt Manor was just the opening act. 3 separate times across the war, this same division did not just win a fight, it made Hitler's supposedly unstoppable war machine look genuinely pathetic while doing it. Stick around because the small details in each of these stories are honestly funnier and more insane than anything you'll find in the textbooks. Let's start in the town of Carentan. 4 days after D-Day, the town of Carentan sat in the middle of a dairy farming region in Normandy, and it mattered far more than its small population of about 4,000 people suggested. Carentan connected the American beachheads at Utah and Omaha, and if the Germans held onto it, they could pour reinforcements straight into the gap between the 2 landing zones and potentially split the entire invasion in half. Major General Maxwell Taylor knew this, and his exhausted paratroopers fought a brutal, multi-day advance down a heavily defended causeway toward the town, an elevated road nicknamed Purple Heart Lane, that offered little cover against the German machine guns waiting on the other side. After days of savage, close-quarters fighting, including a legendary bayonet charge led by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, the German defenders began running out of ammunition and started slipping out of the town under the cover of darkness. Around midnight, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, tasked with coordinating the final assault, orchestrated a heavy artillery bombardment that slammed the retreating Germans. By sunrise, Carentan was firmly in American hands. French civilians came out of hiding, greeting the exhausted soldiers standing in their streets and uncorking wine bottles that had escaped enemy hands. But here's the detail where the real sting comes in. Before any of that happened, a demolition team from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division dropped behind German lines to blow up bridges over the Douve River, cutting off German reinforcements before they could ever reach Carentan. These men called themselves the Filthy 13, a nickname earned back in England because they chose to use their strict water rations for cooking poached game rather than washing or shaving. Their unofficial leader, Sergeant Jake McNeese, was part Choctaw, a Native American tribe from what is now the southeastern United States, and before the jump, he shaved his men's heads into mohawks and covered their faces in war paint as a tribute to his heritage. A newspaper photographer snapped a picture of these terrifying-looking men just hours before the invasion, and the public was instantly captivated. But the night drop was pure chaos, scattering the squad across Normandy. Several members were killed or captured, but the survivors, joined by scattered paratroopers from other units, pressed on anyway and completed their mission, destroying the exact bridges the Germans desperately needed. You can now picture the embarrassment on the German side. An elite, disciplined army, humiliated not by a polished unit of textbook soldiers, but by a handful of unwashed troublemakers with mohawks who later became the direct inspiration for the movie The Dirty Dozen. Hitler's forces got outmaneuvered by men who looked like they belonged in a biker gang rather than the United States Army, and that sting stuck with the German command for the rest of the campaign. And it wasn't just the Filthy 13 who left a mark. The officer directly responsible for defending Carentan was Major Friedrich von der Heydte, commander of the elite 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, a battle-hardened veteran unit and not some hollow garrison force. In intelligence assessments and later accounts, von der Heydte is said to have conceded that the American paratroopers had shattered his conception of what was militarily possible, and he singled out their aggression, their individual initiative, and their tactical flexibility as qualities his own elite troops hadn't fully anticipated. Coming from the commander of one of the Wehrmacht's most respected airborne units, That's about as close to a professional compliment as the German side was capable of giving. Now fast forward to early May 1945, and honestly, this might be the most surreal chapter of the entire war. By early May 1945, with Hitler already dead in his Berlin bunker, Allied forces raced toward Berchtesgaden, the Bavarian town where Hitler and his top Nazi officials had built their private mountain retreats. Perched above the town, roughly 3,000 feet up a mountainside, sat the Kehlstein House, better known as the Eagle's Nest, a lavish chalet built for Hitler's 50th birthday and connected to the valley below by a tunnel and a polished brass elevator. Elements of the American 3rd Infantry Division arrived in the town first on May 4th alongside the French 2nd Armored Division, while the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne under Colonel Robert Sink arrived soon after on the morning of May 5th. The Germans had disabled the power to the elevator before retreating, forcing soldiers to hike to the top. What the paratroopers found waiting for them was its own kind of irony. Rather than fanatical last-stand resistance, they found mass surrender. Some of the highest-ranking Nazis captured in and around Berchtesgaden, including Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring and Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, along with the local Bavarian garrisons, reportedly made no secret of their relief that it was elite American troops taking them into custody rather than the Soviet Red Army closing in from the east. Accounts describe a strange, almost submissive respect for men who had spent years commanding armies, a recognition that they were being processed by professional soldiers rather than facing the reprisals they feared from the Eastern Front. That surrender was only half the story, though. As units secured the area, soldiers began clearing the massive Obersalzberg complex, which held one of the largest private collections of stolen art, gold, and luxury goods assembled anywhere during the war. Buried beneath the complex sat sprawling wine cellars stocked with thousands of bottles of the finest cognac and champagne in Europe, hoarded by the Nazi elite. Troops from various divisions quickly began helping themselves, with some accounts describing soldiers dumping the water out of their canteens just to make room for wine. One soldier from Easy Company, Henry Oaksner, later described finding rooms full of medical supplies alongside the legendary cellars. A famous photograph shows officers Richard Winters, Lewis Nixon, and Harry Welsh casually sipping drinks on a terrace at the Grand Hotel Berchtesgadener Hof with the Alps behind them, days after some of the hardest fighting of their lives. Nixon alone reportedly secured a massive stash of the high-quality alcohol for his fellow officers. Elsewhere in the complex, a soldier named Fred Butts wandered into Hermann Göring's private villa and walked out with a gold-hilted ceremonial sword as a souvenir. Historians eventually noted that this entire episode became known for the $1 million hangover due to the sheer volume of wealth and alcohol consumed and uncovered. And there is something almost poetic about it. Hitler spent years constructing a mountain fortress meant to symbolize the untouchable power of the Nazi regime, stocked with treasures looted from across an entire continent, and it ended with Allied soldiers lounging in the sun, drinking the regime's private stock, and treating the crown jewel of his empire like a tourist attraction. No battle, no siege, just soldiers casually helping themselves to everything Hitler had hoarded, while his supposedly impenetrable retreat became a glorified party house for the men who beat him. Now, quick rewind to December of 1944, and this is the moment that turned the 101st Airborne into legends. Hitler launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, hoping to split the Allied armies in half and force a negotiated peace before the war reached German soil. The crossroads town of Bastogne sat directly in the path of his advance, and whoever controlled it controlled the roads that German tanks desperately needed. On December 17th, with General Taylor away at a conference in Washington, the division loaded into open trucks and drove more than 100 miles through freezing weather, arriving in Bastogne mere hours ahead of the German army. Command fell to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the same artillery officer from Carentan, and within days his division was completely surrounded, cut off from supplies, running desperately low on ammunition, food, and medical equipment, all while temperatures dropped well below freezing. On December 22nd, 4 German soldiers approached the American lines, waving white flags, and delivered a written ultimatum demanding surrender within 2 hours or the town would be annihilated by artillery. When the message reached McAuliffe, he reportedly laughed and blurted out, "Aw, nuts," before officially typing up his response. His staff loved the line so much that they convinced him to send it exactly as written. The official American reply to Hitler's army delivered through Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment was a single word: nuts. The German officers receiving the message had absolutely no idea what it meant, and Harper had to explain that it translated roughly to go to hell. Weather cleared the very next day, allowing supply planes to finally drop desperately needed ammunition and medicine into the pocket, and on December 26th, tanks from General George Patton's Third Army broke through the German ring, with a Sherman tank nicknamed Cobra King making first contact. Here's where the sting really lands, though. This wasn't a fresh, well-equipped division holding off a weakened enemy. These paratroopers were fighting without proper winter clothing, some of them wrapping bedsheets around themselves as makeshift camouflage in the snow while facing elite German panzer divisions, some of the most feared armored units in Hitler's entire military. And they held. Not for a day, not for 2 days, but for over a week. Badly outnumbered and low on nearly everything a fighting force needs to survive. The soldiers themselves later adopted the nickname the Battered Bastards of Bastogne, and they wore it with pride rather than shame. Think about what that meant for German morale. Hitler had promised his commanders a quick, decisive strike that would shatter American resolve within days, and instead, his tank division spent a week getting stopped cold by a unit that had arrived without armor, without a fortified position, and without a real supply line. When Patton's tanks finally broke through, division veterans made a point of noting that nobody in the 101st Airborne ever considered themselves rescued, since they had already held the line on their own terms. That's not just a military defeat for Hitler, that's a devastating blow to the Wehrmacht's reputation as an unstoppable mechanized force. To Hitler, Bastogne was just a pin on a map blocking a road network. He did not issue statements praising or directly naming the 101st Airborne because doing so would admit that a single, unarmored American division was humiliating his elite panzer armies. He blamed his own generals' lack of willpower for the failure, completely ignoring the elite tactical resilience of the Screaming Eagles. While the battles on the ground raged, the Nazi leadership back in Berlin faced a quiet crisis, trying to reconcile their own hateful propaganda with the terrifying reality of the 101st Airborne. Publicly, Reich Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels dismissed American paratroopers as nothing more than the criminal dregs of society and Chicago gangsters in uniform, claiming a racially mixed democracy could never produce elite warriors. But behind closed doors, German military intelligence sang a completely different tune. Confidential files circulated among the Nazi elite marked the 101st as an attack unit of the highest priority, warning commanders that these all-volunteer soldiers possess lethal physical conditioning and unprecedented firepower. By the time the Screaming Eagles dropped into the Netherlands for Operation Market Garden, the illusion of a weak American military was completely shattered. Fighting to hold Hell's Highway, their relentless aggression forced Field Marshal Walter Model to desperately warn his commanders that these paratroopers were fanatical, highly mobile, and stubborn in defense. The Waffen-SS even began calling them the Devils in Baggy Pants, explicitly noting in their combat logs that the 101st unnerved German defenders because they flatly refused to retreat when their flanks were exposed. This decentralized, unyielding style of warfare deeply troubled Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler. Obsessed with creating his own fanatical elite, Himmler actually used the Western paratroopers as a bitter example to scold his own SS officers, demanding they replicate the individual, fanatical initiative of the Americans. The ultimate admission of their exceptional skill, however, came after the war. During Allied interrogations, Colonel General Alfred Jodl, chief of the German Armed Forces High Command, was asked about the true capability of the American military. He explicitly singled out the airborne forces, admitting that the 101st and 82nd were, quote, among the finest shock troops we encountered on any front. A final confession that the German elite had utterly miscalculated the raw grit of the American soldier. Now we can think about the arc of this whole story. It started with 12 men crawling toward 4 cannons at Brecourt Manor, and it never really slowed down from there. At Carentan, 13 unwashed misfits with mohawks blew up bridges the German army needed and helped secure a town that protected the entire Normandy invasion. At Bastogne, an undersupplied, freezing division with no armor stopped some of Hitler's best tank divisions cold for over a week and answered his surrender demand with a single word of contempt. And at Berchtesgaden, the very same paratroopers ended the war in Europe by casually drinking Hitler's private wine collection on the terrace of his own mountain retreat. 3 different moments, 3 very different kinds of humiliation, and one division responsible for all of them. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.